I entitled this message Loving Communication. Kind of doing a little mini series on marriage. But I kind of want to preface it a little bit by saying that loving communication sounds really good. It's just how to talk to each other. And it really applies to really all of our relationships, what I'm going to talk about today. And, you know, Christianity and authentic spirituality is so much about relationships. It's about righteousness, which means right relationships. And we've talked about this so much. And probably nothing is more important in a relationship than communication. And so if we can just learn to talk to one another and talk to one another in a loving way, in a constructive way that builds people up, it's going to make a huge difference in our lives and in our relationships. And when communication has broken down, that's when relationships kind of start to break down. There's a story of a man who, from Illinois, who came from the snowy streets of Chicago to vacation down in sunny Florida. And his wife was on a business trip, and she was going to meet him there the next day. And so he went down to the resort down there in Florida where he was staying, and they had like a little business office that he used as he was getting ready, waiting for his wife. And while he was there at the computer, he decided he was going to send his wife an email. And he misspelled the email address by one letter, and it actually ended up going, his email, to an elderly preacher's wife who had lost her husband the day before. And so she went into the study the day after her husband passed away, and her family heard this loud, piercing shriek and then ran in to find her passed out on the floor. And they went in and looked on the screen, and this was the email that she read. Dearest wife, all checked in, everything prepared for your arrival tomorrow. P.S. It sure is hot down here. And so you can see that like misunderstanding and miscommunication is a really big deal and can have grave consequences, and especially so in a marriage relationship. H. Norman Wright, who's one of the most prolific Christian authors writing about marriage, in his book on marriage communication, writes in the foreword, "The number one problem in marriages today, so say many specialists in family relations, is not sex, money, or children, but lack of communication between the husband and wife." He then goes on in his book to build a case that communication is the number one issue in marriages today, that communication is the best preventative and medicine and prescription to keep your marriage healthy and happy, and it is the key to a happy, healthy, and successful marriage, that we simply need to learn to talk with one another. And as I was looking at this idea of communication and how to communicate, we certainly want to communicate in love. And there's no passage in the Scripture that talks more about love. And I think than 1 Corinthians 13, which I'm sure many of you even had read at your marriage, at your wedding, which I think is a good thing, because we should deal with each other in a loving way, especially in a marriage, and we should especially communicate to one another that way. And so allow me just to read the passage. I know that you're probably familiar with it, but it's good stuff. So let's just read through it once again. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always preserves. This passage is gold when it comes to communicating, and especially marriage communication. For example, it says that love is kind. It is not proud, and it is not self-seeking. In other words, it's not about us. That we are to treat the other person as more important than ourselves, that our spouse is valuable, our spouse is precious to us, our spouse is at least as significant, if not more significant to us than we are. And I confess that in the daily grind, it's very easy to come to that place where we forget about how awesome our spouse is and about how valuable they are to us, and we begin to take them for granted. Dr. Howard Hendricks, who is the longtime professor of marriage and family counseling at Southwestern Seminary and is really kind of a rock star in the psychology and counseling community. He's written dozens upon dozens of books and is really probably the most respected voice in Christian counseling. And he tells a story of a guy who came in to see him one time wanting justification to divorce his wife. And to bolster his position, the man just rattled off all of his wife's faults. And so he listed fault after fault after fault after fault, Dr. Hendricks said, for like nearly an hour. And when he was finished, Dr. Hendricks just looked at the man and said, wow, your wife sounds really awful. Like, for real, she sounds like the most terrible person I've ever heard about. And the man just kind of smiled, knowing that he had communicated his point to Dr. Hendricks. And then Dr. Hendricks looked at him and said, well, what in the world did you do to make her that way? And the man said, well, I didn't do anything. That's just how she is. And Dr. Hendricks says, well, I kind of find that hard to believe. That someone as smart and sensitive and reasonable as you would ever marry a person like that. And the man thought for a minute and said, well, I guess, maybe you have a point. And Dr. Hendricks says, look, give me a week. I want you to go home and write a similar list of all of the reasons why you married your wife in the first place, and then come back and we'll talk. So the man goes home and comes back a week later, and he's really sheepish and tentative, and he says, hey, Doc, I'm not really sure I'm going to be needing your services anymore. I don't really want to divorce my wife. Now, in working through the list, I realized what a wonderful woman I married, and I want to work at winning her heart back. I guarantee you that his newfound perspective changed the way that he treated his wife, changed the way that he communicated with his wife. You see, we have this incredible capacity as human beings of, treating the people we love the most the poorest. I've seen people say things to their spouse that they would never say to their boss or a client or even a stranger on the street. And yet their spouse is the most important person in their lives. And so, if they truly are the most important person in our lives, then we need to treat them accordingly. We need to communicate accordingly with them. And so I just want to offer a few suggestions, and these are things that as I kind of work through the spirit of the passage, just kind of brainstorm in my own head of things I think that might help us in this particular area to appreciate our spouse and not take them for granted. Because I think that's really kind of a foundation. If we're gonna communicate with our spouse, that has to be part of it. I think the first thing is it's important to thank God daily for your spouse, like for specific things, to remind even yourself just how much you do appreciate them and how valuable they are and how important they are, so that you do not take them for granted. I think second, always be sure to use positive, uplifting, and encouraging and affirming language with your spouse. Again, we sometimes use language with our spouse that we wouldn't use with other people. Attitudes with our spouse that we wouldn't use with other people. And yes, I know there's an intimacy there, and we can kind of let our hair down and be a lot more real with our spouse and all that. But it's not an excuse to speak to them in a rude or derogatory way, or in a dismissive way, or in a patronizing way. When we speak with them And as we try to communicate, we should intentionally do so in a way that is affirming and uplifting and encouraging. And I think finally, it's important for us to find tangible ways to express love to our spouse on a regular basis. And this is going to look different for different people. Gary Smalley, the famous Christian counselor, talks about the love languages, and there's the 5 love languages and how different people perceive love differently. Some people perceive love through affirmation, and for some people it's time, and for some people it's gifts or service or touch. And I think it's important for us to find out what it is that communicates love to our spouse, and then make an attempt and an effort to express love to the way that they most perceive and understand love. Our tendency is to try and give love in the way that we perceive and understand love, and that's not necessarily the way they're going to perceive it. But really, it's this idea of what we see in the text, that kindness, humility, selflessness need to be woven in to our relationship and how we relate to one another, especially in how we communicate with one another. And I think thanking God daily, using encouraging language, and expressing love regularly, goes a long way in accomplishing those things, which will not only improve the communication in your marriage, but I think will improve our marriages overall. I think the second insight that we gain from 1 Corinthians 13 regarding communication in marriage, and really communication in general for Christians, is when it says that love is patient. It is not rude, and it is not easily angered. And in essence, really what the passage is saying is that we need to be loving towards others even when we don't feel like it. Now, this is hard. Well, it's easy to be nice to our spouse or to other people when they're being nice to us. But what about when they're being stubborn, demanding, insensitive, or unreasonable? Like, I'm working on this message, this very message. I'm actually at this very spot, and I'm writing furiously because I don't want to miss anything, because I'm kind of flowing there, and my concentration is fragile. It's, my focus is just, easily, my mind's, kind of small, and so keeping it all in there and getting it working is hard, and so I'm really focused and going, and the phone rings, and it's Cindy. And I always pick up the phone for Cindy if I see it. But, if I don't see it, I don't pick it up, obviously. But if it's her, I always, okay, that's it. And she's calling like, she usually does, because, she wants to know what I'm doing, or what I'm thinking, or to tell me what she's doing or what she's thinking, or, as I suspect, sometimes because she's kind of bored and wants somebody to talk to. Or in this case, she saw some airline tickets to California and thought maybe we could go out and visit some of our family and friends. And so I'm tempted to say, like, what do you want? Can't this wait until I get home? Can't this wait until later? I'm busy. Why are you always interrupting me? But I didn't do that. Because I'm writing this message. And I'm at this exact spot. And I thought, man, I need to respond in a way that is patient and not rude and not easily angered. And then I thought about why she was calling. And she's calling because she wants us to do something together. She wants us to share an experience, and she wants to share the joy of her discovery of this possibility, and that she's excited about the possibility. And really, honestly, that's when you kind of drill down into it, that's why she always calls. Because she wants to connect. She wants to have a relationship. She wants to share life. And so, how can I really falter for that? Like, she, would I rather she not want to connect or not want to have a relationship? Well, no. And so I guess a few interruptions is really a small price to pay to have a good relationship with my spouse, with my wife. And I think that's really a lot of the spirit of the text is, love is patient. It's not rude. It's not easily angered, which means that we need to look at where that other person is coming from. Put ourselves in their place. When something happens and something goes down in our relationship or something is said, our tendency oftentimes is to react. And when we're tempted to react in an impatient way or a rude way or in an angry way, especially towards our spouse, we need to stop and assess the situation and ask ourselves, really, what's going on here? Where is my spouse coming from? What is it that they're really trying to say? And I think it's in that moment when we genuinely need to listen more than we talk, rather than just react. And I know that some of you are thinking, well, you're not privy to what goes on in my marriage. Because sometimes, my spouse is just out of bounds and really, just plain wrong. Okay. That means that your spouse is human, just like you. That your spouse is flawed and imperfect, just like you. That's the point. That's even the point of Christian spirituality. It's that we share patience and understanding and forgiveness and tolerance, even as God shared, was patient and gracious and understanding and forgiving towards us. That we are patient and gracious and understanding and forgiving towards them, even as we want them to be, patient and gracious and understanding and forgiven when we are out of bounds and when we are wrong. It's not just common courtesy, it's actual Christian spirituality at work. And this will not only improve the communication in your marriage, but it will improve your marriage. And so the text is telling us things like, love is kind and selfless, and now it's patient and it's gracious. And then the text communicates, there's another kind of a family of thoughts there, or thoughts that kind of go together, and it's this idea that love keeps no records of wrongs. That it does not delight in evil, but rejoices in the truth. It always protects and preserves and hopes and all of that kind of stuff. And what it's saying is that love doesn't play games. It doesn't seek to win. It doesn't lie, twist, cheat, and manipulate. It doesn't see the other person as a means for your own personal gratification. It doesn't see the other person as your servant. It doesn't see the person as a means to an end. Last week we talked about mutual service and mutual submission in marriage, and I think that mutual submission is really a 50-50 proposition. And it's not that each partner is trying to get their 50%. It's that when each person is genuinely trying to give 100% of themselves away, that it comes out pretty even. In fact, both parties in that case feel like they're getting the better of the deal. And so when we try to do that, that's good. But it will not happen if either spouse is thinking, what's in it for me? Because when one spouse is thinking about what they can get and what they need to take out of the relationship, their thinking is a little different. They're going to seek to take advantage of the situation and take advantage of the other person, even if they don't realize that's exactly what it is they're doing. And they're going to have a tendency to say things like, again, for example, don't you want me to be happy? You'd let me buy this car if you really loved me. If you don't do what I want, you're not a good Christian. If you don't do what I want with the kids, you're not a good parent. How dare you? What about the things that you've done in the past? I can do what I want because of the things that you've done. You can't question me because of the things that you've done. You owe me because of the things that you've done. I will never let go of the things that you've done. No, I wasn't at the bar. I was with Jimmy. Yeah, that's it, Jimmy's. No, I didn't shop today. This old thing, I've had it for years. Stop nagging me. What? Are you keeping score? You don't love me. You always do this. You never do that. Well, what about the time I did do this and I did do that? Well, that doesn't count. Why can't you be more like so-and-so? The Bible says you're supposed to behave this way. You know, I'm talking about those emotional and psychological games that we often play with our spouse, or that people often play with their spouse in order to manipulate them into doing what it is they want them to do. It's the age-old battle of the sexes that has been going on for millennia. And the biggest weapon in that battle is emotion. And one of the greatest emotions that people use is anger. We had a couple in a prior church where the woman was very, very domineering. And the man was this happy-go-lucky, fun, friendly, really laid-back kind of guy. And we had a lot of social stuff going on in the church, and they came to everything that we did. And, you know, he'd be sitting there having a good time, you know, cutting up with everybody and joking, and then she'd just give him the death stare, you know, like, you know, he'd jump. He'd start minding his P's and Q's, you know, really quick. And if she wanted to go home early and he didn't want to, you know, she'd just get angry, and they went home early. Or if she needed him to do something with the kids, and maybe he had something else important that he needed to do, maybe something for his job or something like that, she'd just get angry and he'd watch the kids. Or there was a time when she wanted a new car, but she didn't really need a new car, and he told her that, but she got angry and they got a new car. And then she wanted a pool, and they couldn't afford a pool, but she got angry and they got a pool. And whenever she needed him to capitulate in any way, she would just get angry. And then he would do it. And there were times when we were in the social circle there, and she would just pull him aside and just let him have it, you know, right there in front of everyone. And sometimes she wouldn't even bother to pull him aside. And it was emasculating for him and embarrassing for him. And I remember how awkward it was, and everybody would just kind of stand off to the side, and people would say things like, man, I just feel so sorry for that guy, or I wouldn't want to be him when I get home. And anger's not the only weapon that can be used, you know, in an emotionally dishonest way in order to manipulate someone. Sometimes people do it with sadness. Oh, we can't upset so-and-so. You know, we need to walk on eggshells because, you know, so-and-so, you know, might get upset. And sometimes people use sadness through crying or pouting. Sometimes people use anxiety as a weapon. Oh, we just don't want to get so-and-so all stressed out because, you know, they're not going to handle it well. Or depression. Really, it could be almost any negative emotion or any combination of these or other emotions. In fact, this is the clinical definition of a dysfunctional family. Is when the entire family dynamic revolves around the emotion of a single individual. But you see, as Christians, we don't do that. Like, we don't use emotion and words, you know, in that way to manipulate others and to get what we want. Like, that's not how we behave, because that's not okay. And I know that maybe there are some people here who are thinking, man, this is really good because my spouse needs to hear this. Or I wish my spouse were here because they really need to hear this. This is good stuff. And it's all about all of their problems, and that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about us and taking responsibility for how we personally communicate with our spouse and how we personally use words. And so we need to take responsibility for ourselves and how loving we are in the ways that we communicate with others, especially with our spouse. And so we need to ask ourselves questions like, is my communication honest both factually and emotionally? Am I posturing or twisting things to my advantage? Am I sticking to the real issue, or am I digging up the past? Does my communication serve my spouse or others, or does it serve me? Does my communication build up our marriage, or does it tear it down? This is what it means to keep no record of wrongs. To not delight in evil, but rejoice with the truth, and to always preserve and protect and hope. It means that we communicate in healthy, honest, constructive, straightforward ways. And if we do that, it's going to change so many marriages and so many relationships for the better. Like if we take the premise that we started with, that if marriage is the biggest issue, or if communication is the biggest issue in marriages today, and I really believe that it is, because I don't care what else is thrown at you, whether it's, issues with children or sex or money or whatever it happens to be, if you can communicate in a healthy and constructive way, you can conquer just about anything. But if that communication is broke down, then you're in trouble, because you're not going to be able to work through and resolve the things that you need to work through and that you need to resolve. And I think that, again, if that's true, then applying the lessons of 1 Corinthians 13 really are invaluable for us. There's so much here, there's so much richness that just is not only constructive and rich for our relationship, but really, as Dr. H. Norman Wright said at the beginning, it's the key to that happy, healthy, and successful marriage. And I think these lessons here of, love is kind, it's selfless. And that if we can communicate, again, in kind and selfless ways, if we can use that encouraging and uplifting language and be grateful for our spouse and not take them for granted and express love. And love is patient, it's not rude, it's not easily angered. If we treat our spouse with love, even when we don't feel like it, when we stop and assess the situation and are willing to listen more than we talk. And then finally, that it keeps no record of wrongs. It's not, we don't play games in the relationship. And so many marriages descend into this. Again, those little emotional games that we play where we even wield emotion and words as weapons. And if we can work through that in ourselves and how we relate with our spouse, and especially if both spouses are doing this, and imagine what that's going to do for your relationship. But again, as I started the message, it doesn't just apply to marriage. Guys, if you're Christian, like if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, you're called to be a loving person. And again, that has to do with righteousness. And righteousness is right relationships. And right relationships is how we treat one another, how we talk to each other. So how do you talk to people? Like, how do you communicate with people? Is it kind and selfless? Is it patient and gracious? Or are you playing games and manipulating and trying to get the advantage? I mean, you see where I'm going with this. We like to make Christianity about all the, the external, stuff, the hoops that you do, the religious stuff. Going to church and reading your Bible. And the reason we go to church and the reason we read our Bibles is so that we can learn to be loving. And we can learn to do the kind of stuff that we're talking about. So just because you're religious doesn't mean that you're spiritual or that you're serving God or honoring God with your life. You honor God with your life by being righteous. And so much of righteousness is how we treat people. And so much of how we treat people is how we talk to people. And so I want to challenge you this morning, and not just, especially if you're married, in your marriage relationship, but even if you're not, like how do you communicate with people? Do you communicate in a way that honors God and that reflects the Spirit of God? Do you communicate in a way that communicates the love of Christ to other people? And, take a look at that and really examine your life and examine your heart. And if you find that you come up short, and I'll be honest with you, the standard in 1 Corinthians is pretty high. And I try to do this stuff, but I confess that, I fall short too. And I'm convicted by this too, and how I need to communicate, in all my relationships, but especially at home and especially with my wife. And so, how are you doing in that department? How loving is your communication? And maybe this morning God is just kind of reaching out to you, speaking to your heart that, yeah, there's some things I need to do to be more righteous, to reflect Christ in my life, and really to be the spouse and to build the home that I need to build, and to have the kind of relationship with my spouse that I need to have. But, Jesus emphasizes, righteousness and love over all things. And this is so central to that it's imperative that we get this right and that we reflect Christ in our words and our attitudes and how we relate to people.